He treated my bank account like his birthright, demanded $50K, mocked cheap vows. So I issued a final ultimatum that made his life unravel fast. The phone call came on a Tuesday morning while I was reviewing quarterly reports at my desk. 28 years of building my construction company from nothing, and my son Marcus thought he could just demand $50,000 like he was ordering coffee. But when I heard the entitlement in his voice, when I listened to him explain why I owed him this money for his dream wedding, something inside me shifted. I didn't get angry. I didn't yell. I simply smiled, hung up the phone, and made 3 calls that would change everything. Before we continue, please subscribe to the channel and let us know where you're listening in the comments. Marcus had always been different from me. Where I'd learned the value of $1 by working construction sites at 15, he'd grown up in the comfort that my success provided. Private schools, college tuition paid in full, a car for his 16th birthday. I'd given him everything I never had, thinking I was being a good father. I should have seen the warning signs earlier. The first red flag came during his senior year of college when he called asking for money to join an expensive fraternity. Not asking, really. More like informing me that he needed $5,000 by Friday. When I suggested he get a part-time job to earn it himself, he'd laughed. Actually laughed. "Dad, that's not how our family works," he'd said. "You provide, I focus on my future." "Our family works because I work," I'd replied, but he'd already hung up. Then came the graduation gift expectations. A luxury car, not just any car. A downtown apartment, not just any apartment. Each request presented as a natural progression, as if my wallet was his personal inheritance fund with early withdrawal privileges. I'd started saying no more often, but somehow the money always ended up flowing his direction anyway. Sarah, my wife, would intervene with her soft heart and reasonable explanations about helping our only child get established. The engagement announcement should have been a joyful moment. Marcus and Jennifer had been dating for 2 years, and she seemed like a lovely girl from a good family. But when they invited us to dinner to share their news, the conversation quickly shifted from celebration to expectation. "We're thinking a spring wedding," Jennifer had said, her eyes sparkling with excitement. "Something elegant but not too over the top. Maybe 200 guests. 200 guests. I'd done the mental math instantly. In today's market, for the kind of wedding they were describing, we were looking at $60,000 to $80,000 minimum. But I'd smiled and congratulated them, assuming they'd been saving money and planning to contribute significantly themselves. After all, Marcus had been working at a marketing firm for 2 years since graduation. Jennifer was a nurse with steady income. Surely they understood that weddings cost money and had prepared accordingly. The assumption lasted exactly 3 weeks. That Tuesday morning call started innocently enough. "Hey, Dad." Marcus's voice carried that familiar tone of casual confidence. "Jennifer and I have been meeting with wedding planners, and we need to talk about the budget." I'd leaned back in my office chair, looking out at the construction site where my crew was pouring foundation for a new office building. Real work, honest work, the kind that built wealth slowly and deliberately. "What kind of budget are you working with?" I'd asked, expecting to hear about their combined savings and maybe a request for a modest contribution. The silence stretched long enough that I wondered if the call had dropped. "Marcus?" "Still there, Dad." "So here's the thing. We've found the perfect venue, but it's a little more expensive than we initially planned. We need $50,000 to make this wedding happen the way it should. $50,000. Not a request for help. Not a conversation about what might be possible. A statement of need, delivered with the assumption that I would simply write a check. The way it should happen implied that anything less would be somehow beneath our family's standards. Standards that I'd apparently established by working myself nearly to death to provide for a son who now viewed my success as his birthright. I'd taken a slow breath, watching my foreman direct the concrete truck into position. These were men who understood the connection between effort and reward, who knew that money didn't appear magically but had to be earned through sweat and sacrifice. "Marcus, that's a substantial amount of money. What have you and Jennifer saved for the wedding yourselves?" Another pause. Shorter this time, but loaded with something I didn't like. "Well, we've been focusing on other investments. The apartment rent, building our careers. You know how expensive it is to live in the city these days. Besides, this is a once-in-a-lifetime event. We want it to be perfect, and perfect costs money. Other investments. I'd almost laughed at the euphemism. Marcus drove a car that cost more than most people made in a year. His apartment was in the trendiest part of downtown, with amenities that included a rooftop pool and concierge service. Jennifer's engagement ring had cost $15,000, a fact he'd mentioned proudly when showing it off. These weren't investments in their future. These were lifestyle choices funded by the expectation that Dad would always be there to cover the real expenses. What exactly does $50,000 cover? I'd asked, genuinely curious about how much money could disappear into a single day's celebration. Marcus had launched into an enthusiastic breakdown that made my head spin. The venue rental alone was $22,000 for the reception hall Jennifer had fallen in love with, catering for 200 guests at $150 per person, a photographer whose portfolio looked like something from a magazine, flowers that would cost more than most people's monthly mortgage payment, a band instead of a DJ because live music created the right atmosphere. Each item on his list was presented as non-negotiable, as if he'd carefully researched the bare minimum requirements for a proper wedding and arrived at $50,000 as the absolute lowest possible budget. No consideration of alternatives, no discussion of which elements might be reduced or eliminated, no acknowledgement that other couples managed to get married for significantly less money while still creating beautiful, meaningful celebrations. The conversation continued for another 10 minutes, but I'd stopped listening to the specific details. Instead, I was hearing something else entirely. The tone of entitlement that had been building for years, the assumption that my role in his life was to fund his dreams without question or limit, the complete absence of gratitude for everything I'd already provided. Most importantly, the lack of any recognition that $50,000 represented months of my labor, years of careful financial planning, and sacrifice that he'd never had to make. When he finally paused for breath, I'd asked a simple question that changed everything. Marcus, what happens if I say no? The silence that followed was different from the earlier pauses. This one carried weight, tension, the sound of someone who'd never considered that particular possibility. Dad? He'd said finally, his voice carrying a note of warning I'd never heard before. This isn't really a negotiation. Jennifer's family is contributing. Her parents are expecting us to handle our share. We've already put deposits down on some of these vendors. We need this money, and we need it soon. We need this money. Not we'd appreciate help, not could you consider contributing. We need this money, spoken like a fundamental law of physics that couldn't be questioned or altered. The entitlement was breathtaking in its completeness. 28 years of providing for my son, and he'd learned to view my bank account as his personal safety net for any expense that exceeded his immediate cash flow. That's when I'd smiled, really smiled, for the first time in the entire conversation. Marcus, I'd said, my voice carrying a calm certainty that surprised even me. Let me call you back in a few hours. I need to review some financial documents and see what's possible. The relief in his voice had been audible. Thanks, Dad. I knew you'd come through. You always do. Jennifer's going to be so excited when I tell her we can move forward with all the planning. We're looking at a May wedding, so we'll need the money transferred by the end of next week to secure everything. I'd hung up the phone and sat in the quiet of my office, looking at the framed photo on my desk of Marcus at his college graduation. Proud smile, expensive suit, handshake with the dean of his business school. Everything I'd worked to provide for him, and somehow I'd created a young man who viewed my success as his automatic inheritance, available on demand for whatever project currently captured his imagination. The 3 phone calls I made that afternoon would teach my son a lesson about money, respect, and the difference between earning something and expecting it. But first, I needed to understand exactly how deep this entitlement ran and whether there was any possibility of salvaging the relationship I'd thought we had. The first call was to my accountant, Richard Morrison, who'd been managing my business finances for 15 years. Richard had watched my company grow from a 2-man operation to a firm that employed 43 people and generated millions in annual revenue. He understood better than anyone how hard I'd worked for every dollar, and how carefully we'd structured my assets to protect against exactly this kind of financial pressure. "Richard, I need you to run through all accounts where Marcus has any access or signatory authority. I want a complete audit by tomorrow morning." The silence on his end lasted exactly 3 seconds. "Is everything all right, Tom?" "You sound different." "Everything's about to be very all right," I'd replied. "But I need to know exactly what my son can and cannot access before I make my next move." The second call went to my lawyer, Patricia Chen, whose expertise in family law and asset protection had helped me navigate Sarah's illness and death 2 years earlier. Patricia had structured my estate planning to ensure Marcus would eventually inherit substantial wealth, but only when he demonstrated the maturity to handle it responsibly. Today's conversation suggested that maturity might be further away than any of us had imagined. The third call was the most important one, and it went to someone Marcus had never met, but whose cooperation would determine whether my son learned respect the easy way or the hard way. The third call went to James Mitchell at First National Security Bank, where I'd maintained my primary business accounts for over a decade. James handled high-net-worth clients exclusively, and he understood the delicate balance between family generosity and financial protection that men like me face daily. "James, I need to implement immediate security protocols on all accounts connected to my son Marcus. Emergency authorization revocation, effective immediately." I could hear him typing in the background, pulling up account records that showed years of careful wealth accumulation and strategic investment. "Tom, that's a significant step. Can you walk me through what's prompted this decision?" His voice carried the professional concern of someone who'd seen family money destroy relationships more times than he cared to count. "My son just informed me that he needs $50,000 for his wedding. Not asked, informed. And when I suggested he might contribute his own savings, he explained that wasn't how our family works. I need to show him exactly how our family actually works." The typing stopped. "I understand completely. We can freeze all subsidiary accounts, remove signatory privileges, and implement dual authorization requirements for any transactions above specified thresholds. How comprehensive do you want these restrictions?" "Comprehensive enough that he learns money doesn't appear magically when he snaps his fingers, but temporary enough that he has the opportunity to earn back trust through changed behavior." After hanging up with James, I walked to my office window and watched my construction crew working below. These men understood something Marcus had never learned. They knew that every paycheck represented hours of labor, that every benefit they received was earned through competence and reliability. That respect came from performance, not from family connections or expectations. My phone buzzed with a text message. Marcus, of course, probably checking to see if I'd had time to review those financial documents he'd mentioned. "Dad just wanted to follow up on our conversation. Jennifer's getting excited about finalizing the catering menu, but we need to confirm the budget first. Can we talk tonight?" I stared at the message, noting how he'd positioned Jennifer's excitement as additional pressure for me to comply quickly. The manipulation was subtle but unmistakable. Make Dad feel responsible for his future daughter-in-law's happiness, create urgency around deposits and deadlines, frame his spending decisions as my financial obligations. Instead of responding immediately, I opened my laptop and began researching something that had been nagging at me since our phone conversation. Marcus claimed he and Jennifer couldn't contribute significantly to their wedding costs because they were focused on other investments in career building. But what exactly were those investments? Social media provided the first clues. Marcus's Instagram account, which I rarely checked, painted a picture of someone living far beyond what his marketing salary should support. Dinner photos from restaurants where entrees cost $60, weekend trips to ski resorts and beach destinations. A recent post showing off his new watch, tagged with the brand name of a Swiss manufacturer whose timepieces started at $8,000. Jennifer's accounts told a similar story. Designer handbags that cost more than most people's monthly rent. Spa days and shopping trips documented with the casual frequency of someone who'd never had to check her bank balance before making a purchase. Workout classes at an exclusive fitness studio that charged $300 monthly for membership. The lifestyle they'd constructed wasn't just expensive, it was deliberately, aggressively expensive in ways that seemed designed to project success rather than achieve it. Every choice prioritized immediate gratification and social signaling over the kind of careful financial planning that actually built wealth over time. I closed the laptop and picked up my phone to call Marcus back, but stopped myself. This conversation needed to happen in person, where I could see his face when I explained how dramatically his financial landscape was about to change, where he couldn't hang up or deflect or manipulate the discussion through selective hearing. The drive to his downtown apartment took 35 minutes through evening traffic. I used the time to think about the conversation we were about to have, and more importantly, about the relationship we'd shared for 28 years. When had I stopped being his father and become his personal bank? When had providing for him transformed into enabling him? The answer, I realized, was gradual and probably inevitable, given the choices I'd made after Sarah died. Grief had made me generous in ways that weren't helpful. Every time Marcus asked for money, I'd seen Sarah's face encouraging me to take care of our boy. Every time I'd written a check, I'd told myself I was honoring her memory by ensuring our son never struggled the way we had early in our marriage. But Sarah had also been the one who insisted Marcus get a summer job in high school, who made him pay for his own gas money, who refused to buy him designer clothes just because his friends had them. She'd understood something about character development that I'd forgotten in my grief-stricken desire to make everything easy for him. Marcus's building was exactly what I'd expected. Glass and steel architecture designed to impress visitors and justify premium rent prices. Valet parking, marble lobby, concierge desks staffed 24 hours a day. The monthly cost of living here probably exceeded what most families spent on housing, food, and transportation combined. The elevator ride to the 15th floor gave me time to rehearse what I planned to say. But when Marcus opened his apartment door, my carefully planned speech evaporated. He looked so much like his mother in that moment, the same eager smile, the same expectant energy that suggested good news was about to be shared. Dad, perfect timing. Jennifer just got home from her shift and we've been looking at invitation designs. Come see what we've picked out. He was already walking toward the living room, assuming I'd follow, assuming this visit was about wedding planning and budget confirmation. The apartment was beautiful in the way that expensive things often are. Furniture that looked like it belonged in design magazines, artwork that had clearly been purchased rather than collected, kitchen appliances that gleamed with the perfection of items rarely used for actual cooking. Everything coordinated, everything expensive, everything designed to create an impression of success and sophistication. Jennifer emerged from the bedroom wearing scrubs that somehow managed to look fashionable, her smile warm and genuine as she hugged me hello. Mr. Davidson, Marcus told me you might be able to help with the wedding budget. I can't tell you how much this means to us. My parents are contributing what they can, but they're still paying off my student loans, and we really want this day to be special. Her gratitude felt sincere, which made what I was about to do more difficult, but also more necessary. Jennifer hadn't been raised with the same sense of entitlement that Marcus displayed. She understood that $50,000 was a substantial sum that required explanation and appreciation. The problem was that Marcus had convinced her this money was already guaranteed, that my contribution was a foregone conclusion rather than a decision that required careful consideration. Actually, I said, settling into their expensive couch, I'm here to discuss something different than wedding budgets. Marcus, we need to talk about money, expectations, and what happens next in your life. The change in his expression was immediate. The eager anticipation faded, replaced by something more guarded, more calculating. He had heard this tone from me before, usually when I was about to say no to something he wanted. But this time was different, and I think he sensed the shift even before I started talking. Jennifer excused herself to change out of her scrubs, giving us privacy for a conversation that was about to reshape Marcus's understanding of his place in the world. Marcus, I said, watching him settle into the chair across from me, let's talk about the $50,000 you need for your wedding. But first, I want you to tell me something. What do you think I'm worth? The question caught him off guard. His confident posture shifted slightly, and I could see him trying to calculate whether this was a trick question or genuine curiosity. Dad, I don't really know your exact net worth. I mean, the business is successful. You have the house, investments, you're comfortable. Comfortable. I repeated the word slowly, tasting its inadequacy. Marcus, I'm worth approximately $4.7 million. The construction company alone is valued at $2.3 million. I own rental properties worth another $800,000. My investment portfolio has grown to nearly $1 million over the past 15 years. The house you grew up in is worth $600,000, paid off completely. His eyes widened slightly. These weren't numbers he'd ever heard me discuss, and the reality of my wealth was clearly larger than his assumptions. Jennifer emerged from the bedroom in casual clothes, sensing the serious tone of our conversation, but not wanting to interrupt. "Now," I continued, "let me ask you another question. How much of that wealth do you think you've contributed to creating?" The silence stretched uncomfortable and long. Marcus glanced at Jennifer, then back at me, his mouth opening and closing as he searched for an answer that wouldn't sound completely ridiculous. "Dad, I've been focusing on building my career, establishing myself professionally. That's not what I asked. I kept my voice level, patient. How much of my $4.7 million exists because of work you've done, decisions you've made, sacrifices you've contributed to this family's financial success?" His face flushed red. I could see the anger building behind his eyes, the defensive reaction of someone being forced to confront an uncomfortable truth. "This isn't fair, Dad. You're my father. You chose to provide for me, to give me opportunities, to invest in my education and future. That was your decision." "You're absolutely right. It was my decision. Every dollar I spent on your private school education, your college tuition, your car, your living expenses during and after graduation, all my decisions made because I love you and wanted you to have opportunities I never had." I stood up and walked to their floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out at the city skyline that sparkled with lights representing millions of people working to support themselves and their families. "Marcus, do you know what I was doing when I was your age?" He didn't answer, but I continued anyway. "I was working 16-hour days, 7 days a week, building the foundation of what would eventually become Davidson Construction. Your mother was pregnant with you, and we were living in a 2-bedroom apartment that cost more than we could afford. I was driving a pickup truck with 200,000 miles on it, and we bought our groceries based on whatever was on sale that week." I turned back to face him. "I didn't have parents who could write checks for my dreams. When your mother and I got married, our entire wedding cost $1,800. Her dress came from a discount store, we had the reception in her parents' church basement, and our honeymoon was 3 days at a lake cabin that her uncle let us borrow for free." Jennifer shifted uncomfortably on the couch. She was beginning to understand that this conversation wasn't going in the direction Marcus had promised her it would. The wedding budget he'd assured her was practically guaranteed was looking less certain by the minute. "But here's what I learned from that experience," I continued. "Marriage isn't about the wedding. It's about 2 people committing to build a life together, to support each other through challenges, to make sacrifices for shared goals. Your mother and I were married for 26 years, and our happiest moments had nothing to do with how much money we spent celebrating them." Marcus found his voice again, and it carried the edge of desperation. "Dad, times are different now. Weddings cost more, people expect more. Jennifer's friends and family will be there. We can't just have some cheap ceremony in a church basement." The word cheap hit exactly the way he'd intended it to, like a slap across the face of every memory I'd shared about building a life with his mother. But instead of anger, I felt something cleaner, more focused, clarity about what needed to happen next. "Marcus, I want you to listen very carefully to what I'm about to tell you. This morning, after our phone conversation, I made 3 calls. The first was to my accountant, the second to my lawyer, and the third to my bank. As of 4 o'clock this afternoon, you no longer have access to any accounts connected to my finances." The color drained from his face. "What do you mean, no access?" "I mean that the credit card I gave you for emergencies has been canceled. The checking account where I've been depositing money for your living expenses has been frozen. The trust fund your mother and I established for your future has been placed under new management restrictions that require demonstrated financial responsibility before you can access it." Marcus shot to his feet, his voice rising to something close to panic. "You can't do that. I have bills, obligations, rent due next week." Jennifer looked between us with growing alarm, finally understanding that this wasn't a negotiation about wedding budgets, but something much more fundamental. "I can do exactly that," I replied calmly, "because it's my money, earned through my work, managed according to my decisions. For 28 years, I've been providing for you, and somehow you've learned to believe that my bank account exists for your convenience. "This is insane," Marcus shouted. "You're punishing me for asking for help with my wedding. What kind of father cuts off his own son over money?" "I'm not cutting you off over money. I'm cutting you off because you've forgotten that money has to be earned. Because you think $50,000 is something you can just demand, rather than request. Because you've built a lifestyle that depends on my continued financial support without ever acknowledging that support or showing gratitude for it." Jennifer finally spoke up, her voice small and confused. "Marcus, what is he talking about? What credit card? What checking account?" Marcus wouldn't meet her eyes. The elaborate financial structure that had supported their lifestyle was about to be exposed, and he clearly hadn't explained to his fiancée that their expensive apartment, dinners, vacations, and purchases were largely funded by his father's generosity rather than his marketing salary. I walked back to the couch and sat down, feeling calmer than I had in months. "Marcus, Jennifer, I want you both to understand something important. I love my son, and I want him to be happy. But happiness that depends on someone else's money isn't real happiness. It's just expensive dependency." The silence in the room was heavy with the weight of realizations that couldn't be taken back. Marcus stared at me with a mixture of disbelief and rage, while Jennifer looked like she was solving a puzzle and didn't like the picture that was emerging. "So here's what's going to happen," I continued. "Marcus, you're going to learn to live on your actual income instead of your expectations. You're going to discover what your salary can and cannot support. You're going to make choices about what matters most to you, because for the first time in your adult life, those choices will have real consequences. And the wedding?" Marcus's voice came out as barely a whisper. "The wedding will cost whatever you and Jennifer can afford to pay for it yourselves. If that's $50,000, wonderful. If it's $5,000, that can be wonderful too. The amount of money spent on one day doesn't determine the success of a marriage, but the financial responsibility you show before that day certainly predicts how you'll handle challenges afterward." Jennifer cleared her throat, her nurse's training helping her stay calm in crisis situations. "Mr. Davidson, I think there might be some misunderstanding here. Marcus told me his family was contributing to the wedding expenses. My parents have already committed to their portion based on that assumption." I looked at Marcus, waiting to see if he would explain to his fiancée how dramatically he'd misrepresented our family's financial relationship. When he remained silent, staring at the floor like a child caught in a lie, I realized the conversation was far from over. The education my son was about to receive would be painful but necessary, and it was just beginning. "Jennifer," I said gently, turning to address her directly while Marcus continued staring at his expensive hardwood floors. "Your fiancé has been living beyond his means for years, funded by monthly deposits I've been making into his accounts. The lifestyle you've both been enjoying, this apartment, the dinners, the vacations he's taken you on, most of that has been subsidized by money I've provided without your knowledge." Her face went through a series of expressions that I recognized from my years in business negotiations. Confusion, realization, embarrassment, then something harder to read. "Marcus, is this true?" Her voice carried the professional calm she probably used when delivering difficult news to patients' families. Marcus finally looked up, his jaw clenched tight enough to crack teeth. "Dad's making this sound worse than it is. He helped me get established after college. That's what parents do. It's not like I was stealing from him." "Helping you get established," I repeated slowly, "would have been covering your security deposit and maybe your first month's rent. What I've been doing is paying your living expenses while you spend your salary on luxury items and entertainment. There's a significant difference." I pulled out my phone and opened the banking app that showed transaction histories going back years. "Marcus, in the past 12 months alone, I've deposited $36,000 into your checking account. That's on top of the credit card I gave you, which you've used to charge another $18,000 in expenses." Jennifer's eyes widened. "Marcus, that's more than I make in a year as a nurse. Why didn't you tell me about this?" "Because he's learned to see my financial support as normal rather than exceptional," I answered when Marcus remained silent. "He's never had to budget based on his actual income because he's always known Dad would cover the difference between his desires and his paycheck." The apartment suddenly felt smaller, the expensive furniture seeming to mock the three of us as we sat surrounded by purchases that represented years of my labor. I thought about all the Saturday mornings I'd worked overtime, all the holiday weekends spent reviewing contracts and managing job sites, all the time I'd sacrificed with Sarah to build the wealth that Marcus now considered his automatic inheritance. Jennifer stood up and walked to their kitchen island, her hands gripping the marble countertop that probably cost more than most people's cars. "So when you asked for $50,000 for the wedding, you already knew your father had been supporting us financially?" Marcus's silence stretched long enough to become its own answer. Jennifer's professional composure was cracking, her voice rising with each word. "You let me believe we were equals in this relationship. You let me think we were both working to build our future together. But really, I've been working while you've been spending your father's money." The dynamic in the room shifted dramatically. What had started as a conversation between father and son was becoming something much more complex. Jennifer was realizing that her relationship was built on a foundation of financial deception, while Marcus was discovering that his safety net had disappeared without warning. "I need some air," Jennifer said, grabbing her jacket from the back of a chair that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. "I need to think about all of this." She walked toward the door, then turned back to Marcus. "And I need you to be honest with me about everything, not just the parts that make you look good." The door closed behind her with a soft click that seemed to echo in the sudden silence. Marcus and I sat across from each other in his expensive living room, surrounded by the evidence of choices that were about to have consequences he'd never had to face before. "Dad," he said finally, his voice smaller than it had been all evening, "you can't just cut me off like this. I have obligations, commitments. People are depending on me." "What people?" I asked. "Your landlord who expects rent payments, your credit card companies who expect minimum payments, the restaurants where you eat dinner 3 nights a week. Those aren't people depending on you, Marcus. Those are businesses expecting payment for services you've consumed." He ran his hands through his hair, a gesture I remembered from his childhood when he was frustrated about homework or chores. But this isn't homework he could avoid, or chores he could postpone. This was adult life, demanding adult responsibility from someone who'd never learned the connection between work and reward. "What am I supposed to do?" he asked. "How am I supposed to pay for everything?" "The same way every other adult in America pays for things," I replied. "With money you've earned through your own work. Your marketing job pays $68,000 a year, which is more than most people your age make. The problem isn't your income, Marcus. The problem is your spending." I walked over to their floor-to-ceiling windows again, looking down at the city streets where people were heading home from jobs that required them to balance their desires against their paychecks every single day. "Your mother and I lived on less than what you make now for the first 8 years of our marriage. We saved money, made sacrifices, built something together through careful planning and mutual support. But times are different now," Marcus protested. "Everything costs more. People expect more. You can't just live like it's 1995. "You're right that times are different," I agreed. "But the principles haven't changed. You still have to earn before you can spend. You still have to make choices about what matters most to you. You still have to live within your means instead of expecting someone else to subsidize your lifestyle." I turned back to face him, noting how young he looked despite being 28 years old. The expensive clothes and sophisticated apartment couldn't hide the fact that he'd never really grown up, never learned to take care of himself, never developed the skills that independence required. "Marcus, I'm going to tell you something your mother would have wanted you to understand. Money isn't just numbers in a bank account. Every dollar represents time you can't get back, choices you made instead of other choices, opportunities you created through hard work and sacrifice." He was listening now, really listening, perhaps for the first time in years. The defensive anger had faded, replaced by something that looked like genuine attention. "When I give you money," I continued, "I'm not just giving you cash. I'm giving you hours of my life, days I spent working instead of relaxing, weekends I sacrificed to build the business that generates the wealth you've learned to expect. And somehow, you've never learned to value that gift or show gratitude for it." I sat back down across from him, noting how the expensive furniture suddenly felt uncomfortable, designed more for appearance than actual use. "Your wedding demand this morning wasn't really about $50,000. It was about respect, or the lack of it. It was about you seeing my bank account as your personal emergency fund, available whenever your wants exceed your resources. Dad, Marcus said quietly, I didn't mean it like that. I just thought, Jennifer's family is contributing, and I assumed you'd want to help make our wedding special. And there it was, the word that explained everything. Assumed. You assumed I'd pay without being asked respectfully. You assumed my money was available for your dreams without consideration of my own plans or priorities. You assumed that 28 years of providing for you had created an obligation that would continue indefinitely, regardless of your behavior or gratitude. The apartment's expensive silence was broken by the sound of Marcus's phone buzzing against the glass coffee table. Jennifer's name appeared on the screen, but he didn't reach for it. The conversation they were going to have later would determine whether their relationship could survive the financial deception he'd built it on. So what happens now? He asked, his voice carrying a note of genuine fear I hadn't heard since he was a child afraid of the dark. Now you learn what your actual life looks like, I replied. You figure out how to pay your rent with your salary instead of my deposits. You learn to choose between expensive dinners and expensive vacations because you can't afford both. You discover what you can actually afford instead of what you want to afford. His phone buzzed again. Jennifer, probably calling from the parking garage or the lobby, trying to process everything she'd learned about their financial situation. The conversation they were about to have would be difficult, but it might also be the first honest discussion they'd ever had about money and expectations. But Dad, what if I can't make it work? What if my salary isn't enough to maintain everything I have? Then you'll make different choices, I said simply. You'll move to a less expensive apartment. You'll eat at home more often. You'll buy clothes at normal stores instead of designer boutiques. You'll live like most people your age live, instead of like someone whose daddy subsidizes their lifestyle. The words hit him like cold water. For the first time in his adult life, Marcus was facing the possibility that his wants might exceed his resources, that he might have to choose between competing desires, that he might have to experience the word no as a permanent condition rather than a temporary inconvenience. I stood up and walked toward the door, feeling lighter with each step. The conversation that had started with his demand for wedding money had revealed something much more important. My son had never learned to respect money because he'd never had to earn it, never had to sacrifice for it, never had to go without it. Marcus, I said, turning back one final time, I love you enough to let you fail. I love you enough to let you struggle. I love you enough to stop enabling behavior that's keeping you from becoming the man your mother and I hoped you'd become. His expensive apartment door closed behind me with the same soft click that had followed Jennifer's departure. But as I walked toward the elevator, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. The satisfaction that comes from making a difficult decision for the right reasons, regardless of the immediate consequences. The elevator descended 15 floors while I thought about the phone call that had started this entire sequence of events. Marcus demanding $50,000 like it was his birthright, the entitlement in his voice, the assumption that my wallet existed for his convenience. By the time I reached the parking garage, I was already planning the next phase of his education. The frozen accounts were just the beginning. Tomorrow, Marcus would start learning what independence actually cost, and whether he had the character to pay that price himself. The drive home took me through neighborhoods where young couples were starting families in modest apartments, saving money for down payments on starter homes, making sacrifices to build futures together. Real couples facing real challenges without the luxury of parental subsidies to cushion every financial decision. My phone rang as I pulled into my driveway. Marcus, probably calling to negotiate, to apologize, to promise changes in exchange for restored access to my money. I let it go to voicemail and walked into the house that Sarah and I had built together through decades of careful financial planning and mutual sacrifice. The lesson I'd started teaching today would take months to complete, but it had already begun. My son was about to discover the difference between wanting something and being able to afford it, between expecting financial support and earning it, between being entitled to money and being responsible with it. The phone rang again. This time I answered, ready to continue a conversation that would determine whether Marcus learned to respect money the easy way or the hard way. The voicemail Marcus left was exactly what I expected. Dad, please call me back. I think there's been some kind of mistake with the bank accounts. My rent is due Friday and my card was declined at dinner tonight. Jennifer and I need to talk about this wedding situation. We can work something out. The desperation was already creeping into his voice, barely 12 hours after our conversation. I deleted the message without calling back. This wasn't about punishment. It was about education, and the first lesson had to be learned without my interference. Wednesday morning brought 3 more calls before 9 a.m. I was reviewing blueprints for a new commercial project when my secretary buzzed through. "Mr. Davidson, your son is here to see you. He says it's urgent." "Send him in," I replied, setting aside the plans for a medical center that would employ 30 people once construction was complete. Real work, honest work, the kind that created value instead of just consuming it. Marcus walked into my office looking like he hadn't slept. His usually perfect hair was disheveled, his expensive shirt wrinkled, dark circles under his eyes suggesting a night spent calculating numbers that didn't add up the way he wanted them to. "Dad, we need to fix this. I went to 3 different ATMs this morning and none of them work. The bank says you've frozen everything." "That's correct," I said, gesturing for him to sit in the chair across from my desk. "How did your conversation with Jennifer go last night?" His face flushed red. "She's upset. She thinks I lied to her about our financial situation, which isn't fair because I never specifically said I was paying for everything myself. She moved back to her parents' house until we figure this out. Until we figure this out. Still plural, still assuming this was a problem I would help him solve rather than a situation he needed to handle independently. The entitlement was so deeply ingrained that even losing his fiancée hadn't shifted his perspective toward personal responsibility. "Marcus, what exactly do you think we need to figure out?" I asked, leaning back in the chair where I'd made thousands of business decisions based on careful analysis and long-term consequences. "How to get my accounts unfrozen so I can pay my bills and move forward with the wedding planning. Jennifer's parents are expecting us to contribute our share, and I've already put deposits down on vendors. This is affecting other people now, not just me. Other people." I almost smiled at his attempt to make this about others rather than his own financial irresponsibility. The vendors he'd committed to, the future in-laws he'd made promises to, everyone except the father whose money he'd been spending without permission or gratitude for years. "Tell me about these deposits," I said. "How much money are we talking about, and where did it come from?" He shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "The venue required a $5,000 deposit to hold the date. The photographer wanted $3,000 up front. The caterer asked for $2,500. I used the emergency credit card you gave me because I thought we'd already agreed on the budget. The emergency credit card, designed for actual emergencies like medical bills or car repairs, not for wedding deposits based on assumed approval for expenses I'd never agreed to cover." The manipulation was breathtaking in its casualness. "So you've already spent $10,500 of my money without permission, based on your assumption that I would cover your wedding expenses. Is that an accurate summary?" The silence stretched long enough for me to hear the construction sounds from the job site outside my window. Men working for wages they'd actually earned, building something tangible with their hands and skills and time. The contrast with my son's approach to money couldn't have been starker. "Dad, you're making this sound worse than it is. Couples get help from their families all the time. Jennifer's parents are paying for the flowers and the music. Her aunt is making the cake. Everyone contributes what they can. Everyone contributes what they can." I repeated the phrase slowly, tasting its bitter irony. "Marcus, what exactly are you and Jennifer contributing to this wedding besides your presence and your preferences?" "We're contributing our time, our planning, our vision for what we want the day to be like. Jennifer's been spending hours researching vendors and looking at venues. I've been coordinating with everyone to make sure everything comes together perfectly. Your time and planning." I stood up and walked to my office window, looking down at the parking lot where my employees' cars sat in neat rows. Reliable vehicles, most of them, chosen for functionality rather than status. People who understood the connection between work and reward, who didn't confuse planning with contributing. "Marcus, let me explain something about weddings that you seem to have missed. The time and planning are supposed to be the fun part, the part you enjoy because you're excited about getting married. The financial contribution is the sacrifice part, the part that demonstrates commitment and responsibility." "But we don't have enough savings to pay for the wedding we want," he protested. If we had to pay for everything ourselves, we'd have to settle for something much smaller and simpler. Exactly, I said, turning back to face him. You'd have to make choices based on your resources instead of your desires. You'd have to prioritize what matters most to you instead of assuming someone else will fund your dreams. The concept seemed genuinely foreign to him, making choices based on available resources rather than unlimited wants, prioritizing necessities over luxuries, living within means instead of beyond them. These weren't abstract concepts for most people, but for Marcus they might as well have been theoretical physics. But Dad, this is my wedding. It's supposed to be the most important day of my life. Jennifer deserves something special, something she can be proud of. Her friends will be there, her extended family. We can't just have some cheap ceremony that embarrasses everyone. There was that word again. Cheap. Used like a weapon to dismiss any option that didn't meet his inflated standards, any choice that required actual financial sacrifice or compromise. The same word he'd used to describe his mother's wedding, the ceremony that had started a 26-year marriage built on love and mutual respect rather than expensive decorations. Marcus, I want you to listen very carefully to what I'm about to tell you. Your mother and I had what you would call a cheap wedding. We spent $1,800 total, which was still more than we could comfortably afford at the time. But that day was perfect because it represented two people committing to build a life together, not because of how much money we spent celebrating that commitment. He started to interrupt, but I held up my hand. Let me finish. Every couple at that wedding understood what they were witnessing. Two people choosing each other, promising to support each other through whatever challenges life brought. The decorations didn't matter. The expensive food didn't matter. The professional photographer didn't matter. What mattered was the promise and our willingness to honor that promise through decades of real partnership. I walked back to my desk and sat down, noting how the morning light illuminated the framed photo of Sarah and me on our 10th anniversary. A simple dinner at home, her wearing a dress that had cost $30, both of us laughing about something I could no longer remember. Pure happiness that had nothing to do with money spent and everything to do with love shared. Your wedding budget reveals something important about your priorities, I continued. If you need $50,000 to feel proud of your ceremony, then you're celebrating wealth rather than marriage. If your self-worth depends on impressing Jennifer's friends and family with expensive vendors, then you're performing success rather than achieving it. Marcus slumped in his chair, the fight going out of him as the reality of his situation began to sink in. Dad, what am I supposed to do? I can't cancel everything now. The vendors will keep the deposits, Jennifer's family will think I'm irresponsible, and Jennifer herself might decide she can't marry someone who can't provide the kind of life she expected. And there it was, the fear beneath all the entitlement and manipulation, the terror of being judged by his actual worth rather than his father's wealth, the possibility that people might see him as he really was instead of as the successful young man his lifestyle suggested he'd become. Marcus, if Jennifer decides she can't marry you because you can't afford a $50,000 wedding, then she's doing you a favor by revealing her priorities before you make a legal commitment to each other. His face went white. You think she'll leave me over this? I think she'll make whatever decision feels right to her based on who you really are versus who you've been pretending to be. And that's exactly what should happen before two people get married. The silence that followed was heavy with implications neither of us wanted to discuss directly. Jennifer was a good person, hardworking and genuine, but she'd been making decisions based on false information about their financial situation. Learning that her fiancé had been living beyond his means with his father's money would force her to reevaluate everything she thought she knew about their future together. So the accounts stay frozen, Marcus asked finally, his voice barely above a whisper. The accounts stay frozen until you demonstrate that you can manage money responsibly and show genuine respect for the work required to earn it. That might take months or it might take years. The timeline depends entirely on your choices and behavior. He stood up slowly, moving like someone who'd aged a decade during our conversation. How am I supposed to learn financial responsibility if I can't access any money to practice with? You learn the same way everyone else learns, I replied. By living on what you actually earn instead of what you wish you could spend. By making choices about what you can afford versus what you want. By experiencing the consequences of spending decisions without a safety net to catch you when you make mistakes. Marcus walked toward my office door, then stopped and turned back. Dad, I want you to know that I'm angry about this. Really angry. You're destroying my relationship, ruining my wedding plans, and embarrassing me in front of people whose respect I need for my career. I understand your anger, I said, but I want you to think about something. For 28 years, I've been providing for you without asking for gratitude, respect, or acknowledgement. I've funded your lifestyle, your education, your dreams, and your mistakes. And your response to that generosity has been to demand more money with the assumption that my wallet exists for your convenience. He stared at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Hurt, anger, confusion, and something that might have been the beginning of understanding. The son I'd raised was discovering that actions had consequences, that respect couldn't be assumed, that money had to be earned rather than expected. The next few months are going to be difficult for you, I continued. You're going to have to make choices you've never had to make, face limitations you've never had to accept, and learn skills you've never needed to develop. But if you handle this challenge with maturity and genuine effort, you might discover something valuable about yourself. Like what? Like whether you have the character to build something meaningful with your own hands instead of just consuming what someone else has built for you. After Marcus left, I sat alone in my office thinking about the conversation we'd just had and the harder conversations that lay ahead. My phone would ring with increasingly desperate calls as his financial reality became undeniable. His rent would come due, his credit cards would require payment, his expensive lifestyle would collide with his actual income in ways that couldn't be ignored or postponed. But somewhere in that struggle, if he was willing to learn, Marcus might discover the satisfaction that comes from earning rather than expecting, from building rather than just consuming, from respecting money because he understood the work required to create it. The photo of Sarah on my desk seemed to be watching me, and I could almost hear her voice offering the wisdom she'd always provided during difficult decisions. "You're doing the right thing," she would have said. Love sometimes requires letting people struggle, letting them fail, letting them learn that happiness can't be purchased with someone else's sacrifice. My secretary buzzed through with news that the medical center project had been approved for construction. 40 jobs created, a building that would serve the community for decades, value generated through honest work and careful planning. The kind of success that couldn't be faked or borrowed or assumed. I picked up the blueprints and got back to work, building something that would last long after the current crisis with Marcus had resolved itself one way or another. The lesson I'd started teaching yesterday would continue for as long as it took for my son to learn the difference between wanting something and deserving it, between expecting success and earning it, between demanding respect and commanding it through character and competence. The phone rang again. Marcus, probably calling to negotiate or threaten or make promises he had no intention of keeping. This time I answered, ready to continue an education that would determine whether he became the man his mother and I had hoped he could be, or remained the entitled child he'd never outgrown. If you like this story, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share your impressions of this story in the comments. To listen to the next story, click on the box on the left. Thank you for watching.